Hello, everyone. I hope you are all staying healthy and safe. Before we begin, just a few notes. So, the homework assignments will be continue to be in due on Sunday nights. So please try to complete those on time because I cannot accept those ones late. The reason is I'll be posting discussion videos sometime, hopefully on Monday, maybe occasionally on Tuesday. And so once the discussion video is posted, I can no longer accept the homework assignment. In those discussion videos, then you'll have a response that goes along with those discussion videos. That'll be due Thursday night. If you occasionally need extra time for that assignment, you could reach out to me and I would consider that. So today, given all that's going on in our world, I thought we would do something to cheer you up. Wait, no, it's Sylvia Plath. So not exactly a happy topic today, but very, very interesting one. So this video, there's going to be two parts, and each part will have a short response. This is going to be longer than most assignments coming up. So Sylvia Plath, there's just a lot to discuss, and it's going to take longer. It'll be two parts, and it'll be slightly longer videos. Starting next week, they're going to be much shorter, so please know that's coming. Okay, so first, a little about Sylvia Plath. I'm going to go through this briefly because I know a lot of you are juggling extra work and taking care of somebody who's sick or that sort of thing. So I'm going to go through these much quicker than I would in the classroom. So first, the historical context of which she's writing in. We have the transition during her life from the Great Depression to World War II to the post-war prosperity. Post-war prosperity ushered in this new era of consumption with widespread access to television, cars, popular culture that because there were only a few networks most people agreed about or had at least had in common. And those really started to reshape things like family values in different ways. With the return of men from war comes the return to a more patriarchal family structure. And because of all these changes, it develops into this 1960s counterculture that is trying to resist consumptionism, trying to resist militarism and such. So, Sylvia Plath referred to this era, this kind of consumption-based model, as a comfortable concentration camp, saying that it's kind of luxurious in many ways, but mentally oppressive and impoverished. And really, what she's talking about here is that we become kind of manipulated or hypnotized by this new consumption-based culture, and that we all become kind of walking zombies repeating the same phrases from the same media and such. Sorry, at the beginning here I forgot to note, so for this assignment, what I'm going to have you do is list 5 facts about her biography in some way from different parts of the biography. So write 5 facts down. And then when we get to the poems, what I'm going to ask you to do is I'll be asking a bunch of questions as we go through the poems, and choose 3 questions that I pose, and for each write 1 paragraph answer. And that'll be your response to this video. Okay, so back to Sylvia. So she's born in 1932 to her parents in Massachusetts. She idolized her father and longed to please him in many different ways. And then he ultimately dies when she's 8 years old in 1940. It was also the first year that she kind of began her literary career, as same as Elizabeth Barrett. She publishes a poem at the age of 8, Her mother really introduced her to the literary world, and she just in love with it for the rest of her life. She enters Smith College on a scholarship. She came from a widowed household, poor means, so struggling financially, but she does get this scholarship. She was a top student and had an impressive list of publications throughout this time. She wrote over 400 poems while there, but she's rejected from a course she really wants to take in writing at Harvard. And this just, she ends up having a mental breakdown and severe depression as a result. Now, I just want to pause here for a second. There's been some really good books written over the last 10, 20 years that argue that biographers of Plath, they often focus in so much on the tragic ending of her life that they write her whole biography from that lens. And often they'll even start the book with her tragic death and then trace it, backwards from there. And some recent biographers have said this does a disservice for her, that by doing this, you only choose the dark moments of her life when she had many happier moments as well. Just because we have limited space, we're going to be doing a more traditional biography, but just know there are some really good books pushing back at this right now. So she has her first suicide attempt. Her first attempt, she writes a note to her mom and says she's going to take a walk. And she instead goes down into her basement and takes a bottle of sleeping pills. So she immediately falls into a deep sleep, very close to death. But her mom has no idea where she is, and so she notifies the authorities, and they start a search. The police and her college at the time all search the woods by her house. Only to a few days later, her brother, I believe, hears her groaning in the basement, and they come and save her. She'll later write about those experiences in her work, The Bell Jar. But she goes on, she turns it around. And one other note about that is it really is kind of a start of a new era where an event like that would have only made local news for a lot of history, and this gets nationalized, the search for Sylvia Plath, so it really is kind of an entrance into the modern era in that way. So she graduates with honors in 1955, so her life's turning around. She wins a Fulbright and goes to study in England. There she meets the fabled love affair, much like Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning. She meets Ted Hughes. He's impressed with her poetry. She recites his poetry to him. And they have such a passionate love affair that it's really a popular romance to write about and to study and to make movies about. Just one little, insight into that passion is it says at this meeting they were so passionately kissing that she bit him on the cheek and drew his blood, right? It was an intense courtship, and they were married within a few months. It's called one of the most controversial love affairs in modern history. So they come back to England, and they have she's writing full time, and they have their first child, as well as writing her first book, which is kind of a cool parallel there, because I know from writing a large work, it's painful and long, and it's almost like a birth at the end of it. So she then has a traumatic surgery, and she needs to have an appendix operation at the birth with the birth of her son, and at that point, a lot of her writing becomes more frantic, right? Um, Now, I want to say this is part of that uh, reading tragedy into her biography, right? Um, because there's a lot of happy moments weaved in here as well, and I want to get to some of those in a few moments, but we'll stick with the tragedy for now. So, um, she finds out that Ted Hughes is having an affair, right? Um, she says she then has a miscarriage, um, and somewhere in that time period, she has a second suicide attempt where she tries to drive her car off the road. This might have been actually before that affair. Um, and then later biographers have found out that in many ways Hughes was very progressive in that he shared in the housework, he shared in caring for the children. Um, but later on, they find out that he also beat her. And actually, one of the times he beat her pretty bad, she miscarried a day or two later. Um, it's around this time also that she finds poems he's written, and they're clearly about another woman. She writes that the poems were about their orgasms, her ivory skin, and beauty. And then, I think this is kind of characteristic of Plath. She says, but many of them were fine poems. So you can see just kind of her powerful personality, even in that tragic moment. Um, and one thing that kind of also challenges the traditional biography of her is that people just put this all together and say all this tragedy happened and then she killed herself, right? In actuality, one Hughes leaves her at this time, and she writes in her letters and diaries. She says, "I expected to be morbid, but I was ecstatic. I felt the mask a most fantastic exhilaration." And then that's when she writes Daddy and her book, Ariel, which would later win uh, many different prizes, right? Um, and after this explosion, this exhilaration, right, comes winter, and it's one of the coldest and hardest in centuries. Um, she's living with two kids. She's ill. She has no money. And yet she's still waking up every morning and writing from 4 to 8 a.m. She says she finished one poem per day during this time. So she publishes um, posthumously, Ariel's published, right? And the Bell Jar is published and receives good reviews. And then over 25 years later, she's awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature, the first author to be given that prize after their death. The details of her death are what I think draws people to her biography, right? Um, you can read the details there on the screen, but basically she seals off the room. She leaves a note so that and puts her kids in the other room. Seals off this room to the kitchen in all different ways. But she makes sure that somebody's going to be coming to look after her kids, and she then puts her head in an oven, right, and it ends up killing her. Okay, so when we look at her poetry, right, she looks at all these major universal ideas or themes like death, depression, patriarchy, nature, body, motherhood. But she becomes a part of what's considered the confessional poetry movement. Um, and this is a movement that's coming about in the 1950s. It's focused on individual experiences, and I hope as I kind of go through this, you'll you'll see the parallels with romantic poetry. This type of poetry is focused on the eye and deals with subjects that most poetry in America did not deal with at the time. Most poetry at that time was considered high, and you kind of dealt with it in a more formal way. These writers wrote about private experiences and feelings about death, trauma, depression, and relationships. Plath wrote about all kinds of taboo topics like menstruation, masturbation, violence, depression, decrying objectification in many ways. Just challenging these things, many in the way that it parallels like Mary Wollstonecraft at an earlier time. So they decided to write in this way. A critic, Mock Rosenthal, wrote that earlier poems have a mask that hides the author's actual face, while confessional poetry removes the mask. And in this way, it shows the real self, right? And so I think you'll get a bit of that in her writing. I think that's all I want to look at as far as her biography. So let's move into Lady Lazarus. And by the way, we would probably, if we're in the classroom, spend at least, 45 minutes to an hour on this poem. So we're going to do this much quicker, so I'm going to skip over quite a bit. Let me play it for you. So here's Plath reading Lady Lazarus. Oops, actually, I just remembered that my microphone won't pick up this. So I recommend going and searching for this on Google and hearing her read it out loud. Sorry about that. One thing I want to point out about it and why I recommend it so much is that she reads it really in a powerful kind of primal way, and it's really when you read it in your own head, you view it as tragic and depressed, but she almost celebrates that darkness in a lot of ways. So you're gonna have to put up with just me reading it here because I forgot about that. What I'll do is, to save time, actually, what I'm going to do is we'll read it bit by bit and just discuss it. But please go listen to at least one of her poems on YouTube. It's really powerful. Okay, so let's look at this. First of all, it starts with Lady Lazarus, right? So Lazarus is as many of you wrote in your responses, a character in the Bible who's brought back to life by Jesus, right? Of course, there is no Lady Lazarus in the Bible. There might have been, but the Bible didn't write about most of those women, right? So in most counts in the Bible, the histories and all that, they skip the women. So you could argue that in one sense, calling this Lady Lazarus is rewriting the Bible in some way, right? So pardon me for a sec. Okay. My voice has been going in and out, so I may have to take a sip here or there. So I've done it again. 1 year in every 10, I manage it, right? And notice how she leaves you to wonder what it is. It's vague there, right? So think about what we know about the speaker so far, right? And she leaves this hanging. I'll manage it. Manage what, right? Now, as you read this, notice it's 3 lines per stanza, right? Irregular rhythm, irregular rhyme pattern. And this is one of those questions that you could maybe write about. Why do you think she uses this form? What could it mean? And why is it significant? Also, I forgot this is a poem written in 1962, right? So the next stanza, a sort of walking miracle, my skin, bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot. Okay, So she leaves that hanging again, right? It's called an enjambment. That you don't really need to know that, but what it would be, so enjambment, ENJAMBMENT. But what you could write about, so this is another one of those questions, is why does she leave it hanging here? Why does she leave the ideas hanging at the ends of these short stanzas? Now she says, bright as a Nazi lampshade. Okay, I want to come back to that in a moment. And she also invokes religious imagery with a walking miracle, right? The next stanza, her right foot is, what is it? It's a paperweight. My face, a featureless, fine Jew linen, right? So she's invoking Nazism. She's invoking concentration camps here, right? We have Lady Lazarus as the speaker invoking Nazism. And you can imagine this was very controversial at the time. Um, Now, another thing that you could write about would be, is it appropriate for her to use Nazi imagery, right? This is right around, not too long after, just a little over a decade after the news started to trickle out, right? Um, could somebody write about 9/11 in this way now, right? So is that appropriate to use this? And just in case you're not aware of the history, the lampshade and paperweight, a lot of the news and accounts came out that the Nazis were using, the people that they killed was using their skin and body parts to make things like lampshades and paperweights, right? So she's done it again every 10. She's a walking miracle, and then all of a sudden, Nazi images. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy, do I terrify? Okay, so that's a little vague. Who's the enemy? And what's the napkin? I mean, it kind of feels like we get a hint at what it is, but let's keep going. The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, the sour breath will vanish in a day. So, yeah, I think we can see here that it's very much that perhaps the napkin was her skin being peeled off, right? So we get this haunting uh, um, image of her skin being torn off, and eye pits and teeth, that sour, dead breath, right? Um, and by the way, if you go listen to this, there are multiple versions of this poem, and one of them stands off with, yes, yes, Herr Professor, it is I, can you deny? Right? And so in that case, right, it all of a sudden breaks with the traditional, or with her 3-line stanzas, and it also addresses who the speaker's speaking to, someone named Herr, or Mister in German, professor, right? Now we know her dad was a professor. We know her husband was a professor, right? And but I want to suggest, yes, you can read this poem through her biography, but if you only look at it through the biography, then you're missing a lot, right? Because it's confessional, because we know the tragedy of her life, we just want to say, yes, this is all this tragedy in her mental state. Poetry is supposed to work at different levels, right? And so you want to keep thinking about what could be universal about this, what could be the bigger ideas here. So we get, soon, soon, the flesh, the grave cave 8 will be at home on me, right? So we get an internal rhyme in there, grave cave, right? This, with all the irregular rhymes and stuff, give off a weird feeling if you go listen to her read this. And I, a smiling woman, I am only 30, and like the cat I have 9 times to die, right? So here, um, you see a subtle it starts to change a bit, right? Um, in the next stanza, this is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. So whatever she's done 3 times, and basically says it overwhelms the rest of the time, the rest of the decade, right? What a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see. So hopefully you looked up, filaments are real tiny strings, right? It could be any kind of strings. In this case, um, I think given the um, dark imagery here, we get an idea of what she's referring to. The peanut crunching crowd, right? So where do people go that they crunch peanuts, right? Something like a carnival, a sporting event, a circus, right? Shoves in to see. Them unwrap me hand and foot, the big strip tease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone. Okay. And she actually, again, in another version of this poem, adds after that, I may be Japanese, referring to another possible enemy, someone that the United States viewed as an enemy, right? So, what I want you to write about, this would be probably one of the most important ones to write about if you can, is what's going on here. Why is the peanut crunchy crowd watching her in this grotesque striptease, right? And most importantly, how could this relate to feminism, to ideas like objectification, things along those lines? That would definitely be a good thing I'd love to hear your response on. Nevertheless, I am the same, identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. Of course, if you read her biography, it's really easy at this point to think, yes, this is just a biographical poem. There's no other levels to it. But that's just never the case when it comes to poetry. Or at least good poetry, right? So, again, think, how can we generalize this more into more universal ideas? Nevertheless, I am the same, identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. The second time, I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut. Just kind of imagine that, like I picture someone rocking in the corner and just completely collapsing into themselves, right? As a seashell, they had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls, right? And so at this point, it's symbolic death, right? She's dead. And she's down with the worms. One other thing you could write about is who has the power in each different part of the poem, right? We get this image of her dead like Lazarus, and then we get dying, again, left as an enjambment, right? Is an art like everything else, right? So why did she separate that? Why did she, why did she leave that all by itself, the word dying there? I think that's kind of an interesting thing. It's an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. Then again, if this is purely biographical, she doesn't do it well at all, at least the first 2 times, right? So another thing you could write about is, why does she say dying's an art, right? How could dying be a form of art? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And the doing it exceptionally well is easily an ironic thing. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I have a call, right? You have a talent. You have, I do this well, right? Now, I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels like real. I'm not sure how many of you have experienced or have friends who are suffering from depression or eating disorders or things of that nature. Um, but often when you're suffering with these things, you do things like cutting your arm or something similar or hurting yourself in different ways. And when you try to explain it, you say, it's just trying to make me feel something, right? I feel nothing. I feel dead inside. I just want to feel something, right? And that's kind of the vibe we're getting here. But again, she's saying, I have a call, right? And again, who has power here, right? Who has the power here? It's easy enough to do in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical, right? Again, how is death theatrical, right? And just as a side note here, this is all artistic here. Honestly, if you're feeling any of these feelings, go see help. We all need to do that on occasion. Come back in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge, right? Now, a lot of this reminds me of, and this could go back to the peanut crunching crowd, the Harlem Dancer, right? What was going on in the Harlem Dancer that would be similar to what's going on here? I think that's something to look into. For the eyeing of my scars, there is a charge. For the hearing of my heart, it really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood, right? So, meaning if you want to tear her body apart, literally, right? If you want to do all this, there's a price you must pay for that. And so if we're looking at this from a feminist lens, what kind of price is that? What could she be saying that means? Or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, Herr Doctor. So, Herr Enemy. Right? Oh, we just got a switch there, right? So, Herr Doctor. So, Mr. Doctor. Mr. Enemy. Right? So, either the audience changing or she's conflating all of these together into one. You could imagine the doctor here being a reference to the doctors who worked with the Nazis in one way. But professors are also called doctors as well. I am your opus. I am your valuable. The pure gold baby. That's pretty strange, right? I am your grand work. I am important, right? Were the people in concentration camps actually important to the doctors, right? And how, so if this is the biographical part, how's she saying that Ted Hughes and her father treated her, right? What's she saying about herself, that there's a charge for all this? If you think of this more broadly, right, and think of this as a representation of women as a whole, right, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If the speaker here represents women as a whole, what could this all mean? That melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not, I think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir. Flesh bone, there is nothing there, right? Kind of alludes to the crematoriums of the Nazis. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling, all things that would be found in those ashes in the crematorium, right? But again, why is she comparing this to her life? Why is she comparing this to something bigger? How could this relate to womankind? Right? Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. right? So if you're going to respond to this in the power, right? Who has power here? Could this relate to all of womankind, right? Um, here, it's to note, beware, beware could allude to Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a wild-eyed man with flashing eyes who's viewed as crazy, right? Um, and then finally, rising out of those ashes is an allusion to the phoenix, powerful, mythical creature, right? So what she's saying about herself, what she's saying about womankind, what she's saying about her father, her husband, men, patriarchy, right? So those are all things you could write about. Okay, so I'm going to end this first video there, and then we're going to come back and look at Daddy and Morning Song. And so don't forget, I want you to take down 5 facts from different parts of the biography and answer any 3 questions I asked about the text. Thanks.